Well, great. Thank you, you three. It was amazing, and you can sign us up right away. Okay, so I am just going to ask one kind of group question because I really want to, bounce it back out to the audience here. Super engaged with great questions. So we have here kind of the holy trinity of the conservator, the art historian, and the scientist, in this case a data scientist, but that's okay. Oh, okay. Oh, that's a whole other thing. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Okay, so maybe each of you can comment on this as you see fit. But in looking to the future, are you strategizing ways to make the data and your programs and your databases even more accessible to an ever-expanding audience? Has there been any discussion of combining the data with other collections? I think you've sort of touched on that a little bit. And what about promoting the collection and the database and all of this work that you've been doing to disciplines such as economists, social scientists, or environmentalists that might be interested in things like paper furnish and other technical aspects. And I think some of this has been touched on, at least in some of the comments earlier, but I'd love for you to each sort of dig in a little bit if you can. And on a more practical note, can you download data like in a CSV file and et cetera? Okay, great. Thanks.
So just to answer your question a little more thoroughly, is this working? Okay, yeah. Yes. So when I was talking about paper-based, you can't get everything in the talk, but there is a download button. So just under the filter buttons, there's a download button, and it looks like a download button. We've all seen that symbol. And what's neat about it is if you set up a bunch of filters, and now you have kind of like a smaller data set that you're interested in, you hit the download button, you get the filtered data. You can get all the data if you want. You can just hit the button right away and get the whole thing. Or you can get these filtered sets. It's a CSV. It contains all the stuff you would be interested in, not only the kind of metadata stuff, but our measurements. So yes, and that's active right now. So you can go grab all our data and one-up us on the analysis.
Yeah, that's a great question, Leanne. I mean, I think one of the reasons we initially came to a major research university with this collection was fundamentally because we realized that, given the starting point, how the collection came into being and why it exists, that is just fundamentally a starting point. And there are many, many more dimensions that can be brought to bear to look at this collection and derive knowledge from this collection. I mean, think of it. It's 100 years of manufacture, more or less, give or take. It's 100 years of human expression and engineering. It's 100 years of environmental costs, human costs. Silver has to be mined, tremendous environmental, human costs. Paper, Cappy knows more about this than I do. Paper manufacturers would find pristine areas where there was lots of wood and lots of water and then go about destroying them systematically, basically. It's all in here. Joy trees talk about the impacts of conflict. We see that, transitions from, pre-World War I, post-World War I. So there are many, many other ways that this collection can be used to really understand the 20th century.
Yeah, and then in terms of making this available to a broader collection, I mean, this event is really just the kickoff of sharing out tools like Paperbase, the updated back printing site, Joytree's manufacturing histories website, and many others. All of us are probably going to do a lot more work to spread the word about these great tools and methods. And we would also love to rely on all of you to spread the word about these tools to your colleagues and others who you think would be interested in using them. And then also just on my part as kind of the art historian in the group, and a lot of my work is about connecting the work of the lab to various folks in various humanities fields. And over the last year, I've made a real effort to speak not only at art history conference, but also like at business history conferences, for example, to speak to new audiences that maybe would be less familiar with our work, and to make sure they're also hearing about the work that we're doing. So getting a little bit out of our comfort zones is often a really good thing.
That's great, super important. Okay.
Hi, I have so many questions because I'm coming at this from having worked for a custom printer out of college and now working with conservation in a museum. And I appreciate the quantification of data, but for me, the thing that seems to be lost is that most custom printers would make these round, prints for themselves of all the papers that would be available. And oftentimes they would not only make a grayscale, but they would also make the same print on all the different manufacturers' papers to be able to see for themselves. And I'm wondering if you've met with any of them and spoke with them to collect their data, because they have a wealth of knowledge, a real depth of knowledge about not only how papers reproduce black and white, but also all the tones in between and how that matches with the negative, which is a really important component as well, and how that data can then be somehow presented, because we're taking a material and then translating it into like an immaterial presentation. And I'm just, thinking that there is still an element that gets lost of the actual materiality of the print that gets lost in translation from this, even with the sample book.
So I agree with you. Okay. No, no, really, I do. I get it, and I get that it's maybe it's somewhat of a defect to the method, let's say, but it's also incredibly hard. It's really hard to do. If you start taking different approaches, different contrast grades, different approaches to printing. No one, it doesn't, there are some amazing printers out there that are working commercially. I don't think they've ever, maybe they've made close to identical prints in terms of image on a paper, but they're not identical. And so that lack of repeatability, that lack of interoperability is really inhibiting kind of that, for us anyway. We have to give up something. Damon was talking about this. To get to scale, we have to give up a lot of data. And that's one of the things that we've decided to give up, because we just don't know how to measure it. And not only, we can measure it, but we're not sure how to interpret it. That's not a great answer. I'll work on that. But that's the beginning.
I'll add something too. And just to say that, of course, paper-based in our work is by no means the, final comprehensive word on photographic papers and their manufacture. And there is so much more work to be done in this area. And a kind of project like you're suggesting, it would be a great one for someone to pick up, to start speaking with manufacturers or printers, and, kind of building on the conversation earlier about between Anne and Tess about, talking to printers about their work, getting these other perspectives in. We're offering kind of one set of perspectives, but there are many out there that can complement the work that we're doing.
Hi. I think what you've done is amazing. Having done a lot of work like this, I just don't even understand how you did all of that. One thing, though, Paul, that you have done that has been so incredible to hear about has been the study of paper furnish and all of the different species of plants and trees and everything that has gone into these papers, but wasn't really discussed in the forum that you showed today. And I'm just wondering what's going to happen to all of that information, because I think for the study of environmentalism and photography, that's going to be really interesting for people to kind of go through that data. Is that going somewhere?
I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, the story of kind of just the paper fibers themselves. Where do they come from? I mean, it really shows, these global trade patterns. It shows technological breakthroughs and progress. It shows just again, kind of, it speaks to like just tremendous environmental costs, happening in South America and Scandinavia and North America. Yeah, there's a lot of data there. We see, and we can apply some of that data. We see kind of, the 19th century fibers. They make it into the 20th century, cotton and linen. And that's one of the fundamental sort of breakpoints when you can, sort of maybe apply some of that data to kind of data print. Is it pre-1930 or is it post-1930? Pre-1930, you'll see some of these textile antecedents showing up. Post-1930, very often those are gone, replaced by strictly like wood pulp. Cappy, do you want to say more? Because you've done extensive research.
Yeah, so this is an area that I've been really interested in and writing about. Paul, I think 100% would be great to make more of this information available because it is so interesting. But there are other primary sources that you can turn to on these topics, especially if you look into manufacturer archives. One that Paul introduced me to that I am so obsessed with now are these two self-published books by Kit Funderburk, who was a former, I think, director of the paper mills at Kodak, and put together just the most incredible kind of memories and history of their paper making process. And they became one of the, kind of premier paper makers in the world. And he has incredible detail about where they're sourcing the papers, the kind of species of trees that are being used, the shifting supply chains. It's an incredible resource. And I imagine that there are similar recollections or materials available for other manufacturers as well. It's maybe just a matter of looking for them and surfacing them.
Amazing. I just wanted to ask that if drawing from that sort of in those other projects that you might have done on smaller scales and the broader resources available in manufacturing, facilities and things like that, are there any areas of metrology that outside of the needs of the scale of this project, you are excited about the data coming from, or might be interested in exploring on other subjects that are leading to interesting numbers and information?
Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Okay. I gave this a version of one of my presentations, in Amsterdam a few years ago, and then somebody came up to me and was like, "Panel paintings. We can do this with panel paintings." And Damon's right. I mean, his last slide kind of says it all. I mean, you can apply this kind of methodology. Everything has a reflectance. Everything has a color. Kind of jokingly, but not so jokingly, and I think maybe this is why Damon put the placemats in there. Maybe not. Were you thinking of this? No, okay. I've wanted to go to IKEA and buy every napkin in IKEA, every placemat, every napkin, and do the LML method to that, and then sell that data back to them, because what it would show them is they know what everything costs in terms of raw material. They know what the sales for those things look like, and could they benefit from understanding what people are responding to physically and visually, and then reverse engineer that back in. So, and that's kind of joking, but again, it's a way to think about this in a really expansive way. I had a question, over the break, can we do this to inkjet papers? Well, that's absolutely can do that. You can do this to writing papers. We've extended it to study Matisse lithographs. Yeah, there's a lot that the only gotcha in that is and Damon pointed this out beautifully, you can't do 10. You can't do 100. I mean, you really need to do 1,000. You need to kind of somewhat understand what the boundaries of your domain are to make this work.
Doesn't, there we go. Hi, thank you very much. Since we're talking about aesthetics and visual impact, and we've looked at the cameraless work the last 100 years through to Mapplethorpe Polaroid. He's the Hasselblad is perfection, Edward Weston. So I was curious about if those choices of paper choices, which would have to be access, of course, with, wars and everything, so forth. But, when I look at a Weston, I know he's using an 8x10 large format camera and he's contact printing it. And when I look at a Mapplethorpe Polaroid, I know it's the perfection of that no grain, smooth surface, and his pictures. So I was curious if you thought of the artist, photographer, making those choices in the contemporary art world, photo world today, thinking about there are master printers out there. Sally Mann makes her own pictures. Ansel Keefers does a lot of his own work. Moholy Nagy, of course, started making his photographs, but his students would come in and help. So there are different, methods, and maybe as a way to kind of back to the future, the avant-garde as an address vis-a-vis the paper. 19th century people had to coat their own papers and then, go to France to get the optics and Sir John Herschel to get the chemistry and so forth. Have you thought about talking to master printers, not only in the context of custom printers like Chuck Kelton and Steve Refkin, but photographers today who aestheticize the print and make choices, specifically paper choices, based on the aesthetics of their vision vis-a-vis, you look at Talbots, they're very different from Anna Atkins cyanotypes. And would that be a place to kickstart this future idea if, they're living artists who say, yes, I picked this paper, I do, etc.
Yeah, actually, so you're touching on something that we had talked about in the past. Paul had dreamed up doing a podcast or some kind of interview series where we do indeed talk to contemporary artists, and especially inviting them to the collection to come look at some of our papers and share some of their own history with these materials to enliven them and get a sense of how they were used at different stages and different projects and so on. We'll see if we have the time and energy to move that forward, but I mean, that was a dream that we had, and I think it would be a great way to further enliven the collection and to learn more, as you're saying, about how these papers were used and kind of the thought process in terms of how these papers were chosen.
And I think it's to underline why I think this is a great idea. It's a great idea, and if we keep talking about it, it's not going to happen, right? Because I mean, the generation of master sort of analog printers, I mean, we're losing them already, right? And in 20 years, 25, 30 years, I mean, so, yeah, somebody should be doing it. And the time is now, right now, this afternoon.
Hi. So my question's a little bit similar to one that Leanne asked, but I've been thinking about it throughout all these presentations. And taking this data, like thickness, gloss, and applying it to digital images compared to the actual object, do you think that it makes the digital object more accessible materially for people who aren't able to come see collections in person? And then also another question I was thinking of, if we're doing research and we come across a deteriorated print in an archive and it's back printed and we're able to see what kind of paper it was, would going to something like Paperbase and looking at one of the sample books maybe help us decipher what the original print or the print looked like before it was deteriorated?
Sorry, what was the first question? The first question was go ahead. Yeah, please.
Oh, about the digital images.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, so the three of us wrote an article that will hopefully soon be out in our bulletin about computer vision methods and art history. And this is actually one thing that we sort of suggest there, that something like a glyph representation when you're looking at digital images online could be a good shorthand for kind of getting a more material sense of what it would be like to look at and experience that photograph, which can be hard to kind of understand exactly when you're just looking at something on a computer screen. Of course, coming to see something and actually looking at it in person, there's no replacement for that, but maybe to have one way to kind of enliven some of those features, like the glyph, could be very useful.
Yeah. So, in terms of deterioration and what the collection might be good for relative to understanding deterioration, we have a lot of twins in the collection. So you could actually do sort of twin study. Like imagine duplicate sample books, for example. Each one has 50 prints from the manufacturer of a given year. Well, one could have been stored in the basement, and one could have been stored, in almost close to ideal conditions. We have many examples of that, where you can go through print by print and not only see, how the twins have fared, separated at birth, how they've made out, but really the relative preservation characteristics of other papers within the book. So you can start comparing. Hey, why does paper X in both books look particularly bad or particularly good? So yeah, that's something that we could definitely spin something like that up with this collection, sure. And and we can measure all of that, right? So the spectral differences from a deteriorated print could be really informative to see how something, where is it picking up color, what part of the spectrum, and is that different from engineered in color, for example. So we talked a lot about warm tones. Well, that's achieved with pigments and dyes. That is probably from a spectrophotometer, spectrophotometric standpoint, probably very different than natural aging, for example.
I was curious, why don't you open it up to the contemporary landscape after 2016? And maybe there would be some improvements in paper stock in terms of degradation, especially mirroring or humidity control, but maybe there isn't. Just speaking as a consumer.
So it's not really a conscious decision to stop at 2016. I mean, I stopped really collecting in earnest around then. So it's just kind of a stopping point. But also, I mean, the collection is also very much a reflection of my own interests and investment, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, the diversity, the diversity was part of the reason I got into this, was to understand, all the all the different variations that were possible. And really, after the Second World War, you start seeing the diversity of papers and availabilities just drop off precipitously. And so, you can collect, you can keep pushing into the future, but from the genome perspective, you're not redefining the boundaries of anything. You know what I mean? It's good to have it, and it's good to preserve it. I wouldn't question that. But from a a data science standpoint, you're not really improving the boundaries that Damon was talking about. You're not going to find anything that's warmer or glossier or more rough or more smooth if you keep collecting. So from an encyclopedic standpoint, I totally agree. We should just keep it going. But for defining the universe, it doesn't help us that, not tremendously much. What was the second part of your question? Oh, about like preservation concern? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess part of the reason as a practitioner is that you do want to experiment with something. And I was curious if there was any changes in that genome, as you call it, in terms of possibly making it more archival. I don't think anything's changed in terms of being more rough or more creamy or matte. There was a French company called Berger who started making some strange stuff, and there's probably like a Japanese company who does washi paper and like some other more esoteric things.
Yeah.
I think in terms of negatives, Kodak just is the only manufacturer, but then you have these other companies who are doing scene still, and like there's a hipster photo movement. But in terms of papers, I think I'd be curious in terms of encyclopedic things. But I think you're right. But it's just that I just have the B&H product info guidelines to go by.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're a little bit, flying blind in terms of preservation. I mean, you know, there are some basic things that, have been known about since really the 1930s, selenium toning and things like that to improve matters. But, yeah, I mean, and the other thing is too, like we're finding out from prints, with prints made in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, you can do everything exactly right by the book. And there's still preservation problems, like new preservation problems that we're finding in those materials. And so the collection could be really useful resource to kind of reverse engineer maybe what's going on with some of those prints and maybe figure out how to prevent some of the staining issues that are happening. But from a maker's standpoint, I mean, that would be something that we would have to start from scratch and kind of go back to the collection and really try to understand where are the weak points and why are they there, and then extrapolate from that into products that are made today. It's hard work.
All right. Okay, we have one more short presentation from Paul, but can everybody thank these three amazing people for their hard work?